The UN Secretary General has said that this report should be a death knell for coal and fossil fuels, but the industry is still receiving substantial subsidies from governments around the world.
Absolutely. I think this is the root cause of the problem. And when we think about fighting climate change, we focus usually on transport, housing, or food and agriculture. But I think that the real key to fighting climate change is finance. And the problem, as you said, is that we continue to finance massively fossil fuels, either privately through banks or publicly through subsidies. All in all, we finance fossil fuels to an amount that represents roughly 6% of the world's GDP annually. This level of financing has to stop if we want to give a chance to the objectives of the Paris Agreement.
Is it likely to stop then? Is it likely to change, at least in time, to stop the trend that we're seeing?
Well, I think the problem is that we need to realize that industrialized countries have built most of their development on the exploitation of fossil fuels. That means that our democracies are really deeply rooted in the exploitation of fossil fuels. If I take the case of France, for example, for every euro that is given in subsidy to renewable energies in France, 2 euros are given in subsidies to fossil fuel industries, which means that we are so much enslaved to fossil fuels that, of course, it will be a very difficult choice to break away from this fossil fuel dependency.
So who has to make that decision? Is it governments, or is it the private sector, or is it public pressure?
I think the three of them. Of course, governments need to redirect their subsidies towards renewable energies and more sobriety when it comes to energy consumption. But also consumers need to be aware that most of their savings, if they're in usual banks, are funding fossil fuel energies. And most of the people, when they think about their carbon footprint, think about their food, think about their transportation, but do not think about their savings. And yet, savings represent a huge part of their carbon footprint, and they're usually completely unaware of that.
Do you see any sign that we could be moving in that right direction? Would this report perhaps be a wake-up call?
Well, I would like to hope so, but I'm afraid that what would be needed really is to put not only governments around the table, but also banking institutions around the table. And I think that we need to summon finance to the negotiation table, and we need to rethink the negotiation model so that it does not just include governments, but private actors as well.
We're counting down now to this next International Climate Summit in November in Glasgow. Are you expecting any breakthrough when it comes to international cooperation on climate change?
I'm very much hoping that most countries will upgrade their commitments, the commitments that they made in Paris. We know that these commitments, first, are not enough as there are today. And second, we also know that these commitments are not respected, and that very often commitments have replaced action. So I'm hoping in Glasgow that, one, governments will upgrade their commitments, and two, that we will find binding mechanisms so that these commitments translate eventually into action.
What about the weight that lobby groups hold? They seem to have an awful lot of influence in representing the energy industry, perhaps more so than climate activists.
Absolutely, and especially after the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, we see openly the climate activists, but we should not forget that most of the Reboost plan developed by most countries in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis were funding massively fossil fuel energies. And I think that we need to be more transparent regarding these lobbies, which is also one of the reasons why I advocate for industries to be part of the negotiations rather than lobbying behind tables.
All right, François Gemenne, thanks so much for bringing us your insight on France 24 today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.